Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Active Inference Lab. Welcome to our second semester. Today it's August 3rd, 2021. So it's 2 cubed, I guess. Nice date. Stephen, please don't double or mute. Um, Welcome, everyone. We're really happy that you're joining us today. In the Active Inference Lab, we're a participatory online lab that is communicating, learning, and practicing applied active inference. You can find us at the links that are here on this page. This is recorded in an archived live stream, so please provide us with feedback so that we can be improving on our work. All backgrounds and perspectives are welcome here, and we'll be following video etiquette for live streams with muting if there's noise in the background and raising our hand when we're ready to speak. Today, in our third quarterly roundtable, we're going to go over the goals and provide sort of an overview on the lab itself. Then we're going to go into updates for each of the three organizational units of the lab, which are the .edu, .coms, and .tools, and give some updates as well as talk about how people can get involved with each of those sections of the lab. So we'll start with our goals. Maybe while I do some little tweak on the stream, Alex, do you want to go ahead on this website slide?
No, please go ahead.
Oh, sure. Well, this is our website, activeinference.org. And if you go there now, you'll see it looking much like this, as well as providing a lot more information as far as links to follow us on and forms you can fill out. But the goal of Active Inference Lab is to produce cutting edge research and enable real world applications of active inference. So that's our inference side and our action side. We're learning by doing, and we're doing it about active inference. So if you want to read more information about that, check out the website. To provide kind of an architectural overlay for the Active Inference Lab, this figure shows, this figure shows how the different organizational units that are internal to our lab are related to the interfaces and to external communities. So I'll give an overview and then anyone can raise their hand and give a thought on it. The three organizational units within the lab that we're going to be talking more about today are .edu, .tools, and .coms, and that's our internal states. Then, at the interfaces, that's where we have interactions with external entities. So, for example, this live stream is a production of .coms. It's right on the interface between the internal and the external states of our lab, and it interfaces out with broader communities. So those are people who are learning active inference or curious about applying active inference or just what it is, as well as all kinds of communities that may or may not realize that they're adjacent to active inference. .coms also reaches out to other groups and explores how active inference might play a role in their work. And in .edu, the production on the interface is really the maintenance of the body of knowledge, which again, we'll be talking more about soon, but we take a sort of systems engineering approach to diagramming our own activities and also to working internally and externally. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Scott?
Yeah, I think the value of structuring the research enterprise and the interaction enterprise in a way that reflects the content is absolutely superb. That's something that living the and breathing the active inference, I think, is really going to be instrumental as the I still call it the movement grows. There's a lot of desire for de-risking out there, and there's a lot of appeal in different areas, banking, food system security, a lot of areas we're starting to introduce the concept, and having us organize the lab in that way, really walking the walk, I think is really terrific and speaks to the flexibility and strength of the framing in a bunch of different organizational constructs. So I think that's something that's from the start was very wise for you guys to do as an organization.
Nice, thanks. It's almost like if you understand this org chart or this layout, then you're half the way there. You understand there's internal and external states and that they interface together. So any other comments, or we can continue on to the updates? Yes, Stephen?
Well, I suppose the only challenge the perennial challenge is what's internal, what's external, and where's the boundary. And I think that's proving to be an evolving conversation. I think that's never answered in a way, in a complete sense. But is it going to be more like there's multiple ways of thinking about that? If you're doing statistics, if you're doing some teleological morphogenesis type approach, if you're doing some sort of top-down kind of using self-reported data, and you're making a whole load of assumptions. So I think that's quite useful. And one thing that came up, and I'm not sure which paper it was, but I saw Carl Fristen, I think he mentioned the idea of it's something called approximation science, which I hadn't heard before, but there's almost a science of making approximations seem to come into play here. I haven't delved into that, but that seems to also maybe tie into that question.
Cool. Indeed.
I have another.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I just had another comment on Stephen's comment. That idea of the boundary is really interesting because now, because the lab uses the structure, we'll be able to identify those parts of the lab function that are generative and the ways in which they're generative. And so that notion, Stephen, about the boundary and where that resides gets really interesting then, because the entire framing generates awareness. And so the boundary, in a way, it almost is less important. Not that the question's super interesting, but the actual location of a boundary is almost less important than the processes that occur around a given arbitrary boundary within, because systems can have multiple boundaries. And so it's a fascinating question of where a boundary resides, kind of within a complex of boundaries, all of which are engaged in active inference simultaneously in a system. Because it's one of the things I'm understanding is there's no dimensional system that's beyond a theoretical system. Systems are running all sorts of active inference calculations simultaneously of different weightings, etc. And so the boundary starts to become like drawing a circle with tangents in a way, drawing a boundary with tangential active inference dynamics in a way, and you have multiple active inferences going to it. So that was a fascinating. The question you just asked got me thinking about that. That boundary construction in a different way, and very dynamic boundaries that would occur. Thanks.
Nice. And many ways of going about active inference, as we'll be discovering, and we arbitrage that against the clarity of what Active Inference Lab is itself. Like, each of these units are their own informational blanket. There's a drive folder, there's a weekly meeting, so we're sure about that. Those are not the ambiguous boundaries, but that's actually how we go about investigating the real world and the systems that do have uncertainty that's fundamental. Let's go on to the updates. So the first update, which happened right at the end of last semester, was that ActInFLab has a new steady state as a nonprofit organization registered in California, United States of America. And this was part of our lab's strategy and medium-term plan right from the beginning. Any thoughts on this, Alex? Or we'll have more to say on this in just a few slides.
About this action and this new states, important thing to think about is new affordances. And again, we can consider it in a notion of active inference, what possible opportunities we can get and use for strategy realization, some new contacts. And I think we have some information in slide about on some next slide about what possible opportunities are.
Yes. One of the cornerstones and motivators of our project and lab, as well as the registration as a nonprofit especially, is this concept of research debt. And Alex, how about you maybe summarize what research debt means in this context?
In general, the notion of research debt is about some needed and special actions what need to be done for some new state-of-the-art research. Because people who are doing really great research in their fields spending their time to get to that frontiers. But after that, for such fresh knowledge to be accessible to wider audiences in different domains, some additional works need to be arranged and executed, and there are some practices that we understand what need to play their role and make methodological work, and our work with some other disciplines to make this knowledge accessible for anyone with any level of expertise in the field.
Yes, it's a technical topic that we're studying, and so there's a lot of work that goes into getting a working understanding. And so how are we going to scale that and make that accessible? Stephen?
Yeah, I think one other aspect is trust. You know, there's they say in community development, you can, well, this one approach I really like is that you move at the speed of trust. I think that's quite a nice thing. And a non-profit shows a sort of a commitment to values, which, you know, implicitly is kind of there in an academic organization. But the thing with academic organizations, there's certain limitations in that scope, where a non-profit space does offer a sort of a more pluralistic, flexible space as well. But again, making sure that you can establish that trust in the values, which I think the commercial sector, even with people like Google, who said a lot about the values early on, then it starts to, you know, so I think that is an important feature that, you know, is part of this process.
Cool. Thank you. How does the nonprofit registration update the phenotype of our lab? Well, again, using active inference as a framework for understanding this, we can break it down in terms of the affordances that were provided, as well as the new niches, which can be physical, economic, informational, the new niches that we're able to access. So we're better able to scaffold our long-term partnerships. We're able to engage in new kinds of interactions, like collaboration with other legally recognized entities or support of various kinds. We'll be able to apply to new grant programs as lead or as support. We'll also be able to potentially support lab employees in a sort of annualized way or in a project-based way. And it will overall just help us serve through deep time as we provide improved onboarding and accessibility efforts. So anyone who's interested in this set of fields or any other field that they think is going to be relevant here, anything related to nonprofit management or lab management, research program management, making grant applications, some of the more classical areas of interest for nonprofits that are research and technological, as well as some of the more novel or online characteristics that are important, like crypto economics, NFTs, crowdfunding, token engineering, graphic design, website development, tool development. We'll talk more about some of these things later. And of special note for this second semester, and then anyone can provide a thought, is we're planning a lab advisory board. We're planning to arrange this lab advisory board to start operations during this second semester, so the rest of 2021. And we welcome the suggestion or invitation to individuals with high expertise in their domain, people who would like to be part of our advisory board. And some of the following areas of the lab activities will be supervised and catalyzed by the board, especially legal, education, governance, methodology, research strategy, application/innovation, and really anything else. So this, again, helps us anchor out by connecting with external stakeholders and providing people who maybe they're not going to come to the .edu meeting every week, but maybe once a quarter, the planets align and we're able to interface with this person. And so that can be hopefully a win-win interaction. So if you're listening and you think this is you, or you know somebody who would be cool to invite onto the board, just let us know about that. Any thoughts on this, or we'll continue on to the organizational units? Yep, Scott?
So 2 thoughts just on the exempt organization status. It's great. Congratulations on that. One is that the advisory board can also be a source of funding and other resources and network, obviously. And so constructing an advisory board and looking for those folks, or I think that my impression is, again, from the conversations I'm having with finance folks, et cetera, is that there's going to be a lot of interest. People are looking at the framing and I think getting quite excited about it. So there may be a lot of action there, and you can have different advisory boards, multiple boards, as just as a structural matter, just for different functions, et cetera. And you can also, one of the things to think about in the beginning is sometimes having the advisory board be a 2-year stint or a 3-year stint or something, so you can naturally roll people off if people kind of linger too long, or if you want to freshen it up. So kind of establishing that at the beginning is something to think about, keep it fresh. One other thing, if your exempt organization purpose includes educational, then I recall that there's authority out there in private letter rulings where educational institutions were permitted to engage in standard setting, which gets really interesting. One of the things I've told people involved in education, I just spent time with some K through 12 folks last week, is that when there are standards out there in the world, education is about teaching the standards. So if I go to learn French or chemistry, I learn the standards of French and chemistry in school. Where there are no standards, then the standard setting is done by curriculum. And so one of the things, this teaching that you're doing here is also standard setting, because you're teaching framings in spaces where there may be none. And so it's something to think about, that the function of this lab may be both educational and standard setting, and just to be aware that a lot of the outputs may feed into standards efforts, as there could be standards of business, operations, law, technology, and society that can come out of this work. And so that's something to be aware of and to be intentional about if we start to go in that route, and making sure that the deliverables that are intended to be standards have the maturity and the exposure so that they can have a chance as standards. It's something, there's a real opportunity in these new spaces, these new framings, to pursue that as well, and under your auspices of your 501 exemption.
Thanks, Scott. Very nice. Stephen?
Yeah, I just further into the finding standards, and also looking for processes where you've got developmental aspects, and that's, so this might be where there's a kind of a couple of streams going on, because in a similar way to a lot of non-profits that work in highly innovative developmental spaces, you've got elements of that here, unusually for because it's not just the material within a very standard framing, the vehicles being developed at the same time. So developmental evaluative approaches, principles-focused evaluative approaches could be, which are actually very new in the non-profit world, but that have grown massively, might really be good for certain aspects, but there may be other aspects which start to get locked down in more already established processes. And so that could be really, really useful.
Cool. And we'll come back to this idea of standards in the next section, which is the .edu. So it's our first organizational unit, because learning is really at the heart of the ActInFLab. In .edu, the goal is to create a participatory and dynamic active inference body of knowledge. And this is really drawing on Alex and Yvonne's experience with the systems engineering body of knowledge, which isn't just a reference book. It's not just a wiki. It's not just the certifications, not just the standardization. It's actually this way of thinking about how these pieces interact and support everything from career development to people who are just curious to conferences, all these different moving parts that play a role in that living body of knowledge. So we'll provide an update here on the main efforts of .edu, which are the ontology project with a working group as well as an ontology in progress document. And then we'll talk a little bit about the next steps. But any overall thoughts, Alex, on what body of knowledge means or how EDU helps us get there?
I also want to highlight that for lab educational activities in priority, and we understand that only doing some projects with some new people in the field could lead us to have broader community, people who can work in a project with active inference. That's why we are trying to approach this very fundamentally and going through this hard way, through methodological, ontological works, and all that hard stuff.
Yep, totally agreed. So here's, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, one part that I think is really valuable with the body of knowledge is this idea of the system of interest, which I know Alex has, they've got a really well-defined and evolving approach of using systems of interest, and how that interfaces with this active inference approach to a bounded system or object. And I think that has proved to be sort of a consistency which can bring things into the real world in these participatory ways, beyond, say, purely modeling in a more academic context. So I think that's been consistent and is a certain rigor that opens a lot of good questions, but I'm really excited by that.
Cool. Here's a figure that we've seen several times. It's a spectrum that is describing a sort of from the least formalized forms of ontology on the left side to the most formalized forms, the most expressive and formal forms of ontology on the right side. And knowing that ontology, which is how the world is, studying the world and how we frame it, for active inference, we knew that was going to be a challenge, but really the hill that we had to climb. And we started in the first quarter of 2021, right when our lab begun, with compiling just a terms list. Just what terms were relevant, what were we seeing come up, what were terms that people were thinking were relevant for understanding papers. And we're going to be working our way towards the right side of this continuum by introducing increasing levels of annotation and formalization. Right now, what we're working on is updating our terms lists, which we'll show in the next slide, as well as introducing references and definitions. So first, just where have other people defined a term in text, and then eventually we'll move towards creating our own synthetic definitions. And then also introducing translations and translations into natural human languages, as well as translations eventually into sumo KIF, which is, if people want to check that out, that's really what the ontology working group is doing. They're this train scooting to the right day by day, trying to understand this best-in-class way of working with ontologies that Adam Peace and others have developed. And so we're working through the textbook, the ontology textbook, which everybody's welcome to learn by doing as we work through this textbook and figure out what sumo is. And we'll use that to start to develop computational ways of thinking about the terms that are relevant. And along the way, we're going to be structuring and providing all kinds of interesting ways of augmenting those lists. And just to show what it looks like, and then anyone can provide a comment, and especially Dave, who's done a ton of awesome work on these tabs. in our working ontology document, which we'll share with anyone who wants to see it, there's a few tabs. There's the core terms, which are split into a definitions and references tab, where we get up to 5 references, so published papers that say, term X is this, and just quote them. What was it described as in the text, which isn't always the clearest or isn't always the most consistent across definitions, but that's the point. We need to know that. And then the second tab, we have translations. And at this point, we have Russian, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Italian are mostly or completely done. But if you speak any other language, it'd be awesome to have your translation effort. Then we have a terms supplement, where we have kind of a bunch of other terms that we think might be relevant or might get upgraded to a core term later, or just are good to keep on hand in this broad dictionary that we're building out, as well as an equations tab, which Dave did some nice copying over of equations, because even the equations, the formalisms have somewhat evolved, or a letter will mean something in one field, but then it means something different in another field or in a later paper. So we need these kinds of formal ontologies, because otherwise somebody will say, oh, but G meant this in this other paper, and it may have meant that. So how do we go from an internally coherent, like within the paper, coherent formalism to usages and equations that are consistent across papers? So that's what this work of connecting the dots, reading between the citations, that's what the ontology working group is really working on. Okay. And so again, if you're interested in this at all, come contact us and join our ontology working group. The other dimension or project within the .edu is this instructional and interaction design. And the big question here is, in the medium term, how are we going to provide the affordance for people to learn active inference, to update their generative model through action and inference about what active inference is and how to apply it? And we're especially excited about this dialectic between instructionism and interactionism, and how that might relate to course design. And we talked about this in ActInfLab Stream 23, and Dean and others had a lot of really interesting things to say about this. But suffice to say that instructionism is the idea that you're going to just pass the telegram and it's going to be received as an instruction, carried out like a cookbook. Interactionism is sort of where active inference takes us, which is, yes, there is information passing between the entities. However, it's not simply that the telegram message is being received and the recipe is being carried out. There's something ongoing that's dynamic, that's being renormalized at every instance to, for example, the surprise that the sensory unit is experiencing, or the signals that the proprioceptive aspects of the body are sending back. So what does that look like? Instead of just making a sort of list of terms or of things you're going to walk through, and then after you've gotten all these instructions, you'll know active inference. How could it be something that's co-active, with multi-agent sense-making and people working together and interacting to actually improve their model? And then just the last question, and then Stephen, is how do we provide applied active inference education for individuals coming from just so many different backgrounds? That's going to be a question we're always focused on. Stephen?
It might be as well, when you look at that interactionism, it might well be that when people use or learn about how to interact with active inference, how much of the active inference or what kind of model would they maybe know about? So that sort of raises that question of the different people's need to know, so to speak, of what active inference represents or is modeling could vary as we enter into some fields of systems engineering, some fields of psychology, some fields of so that could be quite interesting, is what kind of complexity or scope of the model is needed to onboard for a particular sort of use case or discipline.
Thanks. Scott?
It got me thinking, the last two, your comment and then Stephen's comment, the active inference, the framing, it allows a new matured perspective on how information works. And one of the things I was on a call earlier today with a group that just put together a group field guide to misinformation, narrative campaign field guide, it's called. And one of the things we were talking about was that there's a sophistication. We're kind of wiring up the collective human mind now. And active inference is kind of a necessary prerequisite to being a good neuron or a good participant. Neuron's the wrong word, certainly. A good participant in that system. And there's kind of a civic duty to kind of understanding states and understanding your state and other states. And I won't use the word empathy or compassion, but there's definitely an intentionality and an awareness that active inference lends to systems understanding of how communication works. And because folks who I asserting these days that the mind doesn't exist in the brain, it exists in language and in culture, and the brain is just tuned into the local mind. So we tune, when you're babies, that's why colonial powers want to have indigenous children in their schools. They want to tune their minds to imperialism. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is we're constantly mind tuning each other, and the awareness of other people's internal states and the fact of these processes lends a new power and also new responsibility to shared communications. And as the species is getting tighter packed and the world is becoming smaller informationally, there's almost a responsibility and duties associated with an active inference framing. And it's kind of a respectful element to it, or an awareness, an interdependence element to it, recognizing this space and what is going on in the space. And just to that point, when I first came into the space, the first thing I noticed was, I said, oh my God, my whole life, all I've been doing is contracts, which are synthetic Markov blankets. Right? And there's awareness that I had of what I was doing in the world and how I could frame it in the context of active inference that really does lead to affordances, social affordances, where there's a co-awareness of the processes taking place that can absolutely offer superior pathways to governance, because information governance can be risk governance if properly approached. And so this kind of framing can lead and carry the burdens of that kind of thing, because it's accessible enough once the basics are understood. And if it's a shared framing, it becomes an interoperable way of being. And that's part of what's missing in information now is interoperability on a cross-cultural basis. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. So kind of to close the section, and then Stephen, any last comments on .edu? Everyone is welcome to get involved with this organizational unit through the project-based learning. And the big umbrella that everything is under is knowledge engineering. So whether you're translating languages, human languages, computer languages, whether you're in the archive, in the stacks, looking for definitions and references, if you're working on curriculum development and what that looks like, taking into account that whole interesting dialectic of instructionism and interactionism, or whether you're in the ontology working group, learning ontology, which is just such a vast area, but you're going to be learning with other people who are also learning. Whichever of these affordances you take, hopefully it'll be something that you can get a lot out of by working with the group. Stephen?
Yeah, building just one last point and tying to what Scott said is states, the idea of states. And I think that's actually proved to be where some of the last of the terms list was being sort of worked on as things that related to states is a very much a jump from what is being done in most fields. So you have, even in systems, it's often what's being moved around, the dynamics, the type of objects, but the state of the object is not normally exactly featured in the same way. And it's the same even in psychology. Someone's state might change, but often it says, well, they've been triggered. It's almost easier to say there's a trigger and there's a thing that's triggered someone and talk about it in terms of objects and stuff than actually the state has changed. So I think this is quite a hard concept to get a head around, but comes up time and time again.
And of course, in ActInf, we partition states in a model dependent way into internal and external, and then blanket states or boundary states, which Fristen then subdivided into action and sense. But there we go. We'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. The next organizational unit is .comms, which is communication. And .comms has an internal and an external goal and function. The internal goal is to organize all of the lab's internal projects and activities. That's kind of an organizer role. And then the external goal is to carry out all forms of communication with external entities. So if you email activeinference@gmail.com, or if you contact us on Twitter, whatever it happens to be, that interfacing externally is a .comms topic. We're going to talk in these next few slides about some of the follow-ups from last semester, and then we're going to look forward at a few of the papers we've selected to read in the coming weeks, as well as give opportunities for places where people can make suggestions for who'd be an awesome guest or what papers would be great to read. So the first follow-up, and Dave, if you want to add any comments on this, you'd be more than welcome. On June 21st, near the end of last semester, we had our first Applied Active Inference Symposium with Carl Fristen. And we had 3 different sessions, each about an hour long. Carl was just such an incredible guest and really generous with his time and his answers, super educational. And you can check out the bit.ly link, or you can go to our YouTube page where you'll find these videos. And in terms of a follow-up, something that Dave suggested and took the initiative on is to generate a transcript of the proceedings of this symposium. And then we'll curate that, add in the references, clean it up, and then hopefully, pending everyone's approval, have that transcript as a citable preprint. So instead of, oh, there was this one video that one time where I think this person said this, but maybe I'm not remembering it, or how many times does somebody say that? And then it's like a 10th of them will go to the timestamp, and then a 10th will really listen to what it says. Well, we're going to have a text representation that we can then translate, we can connect back to the formal ontology, and we can just contribute to this knowledge accumulation, and especially some of his answers, which are not written out anywhere else. It'd be really unique and important to have the information in this way. So that's the follow-up from the Fristen Symposium. This short link here, which I'll also post into the live chat, is the short link where you can always go to understand what is going to be happening in the upcoming weeks with the streams in terms of the papers that we're reading. So here we are in the beginning of August, and in the first 2 weeks of August, we're going to be reading this recent paper, Bayesian Mechanics for Stationary Processes. That's a pretty technical mathematical paper. And then in the following weeks, we're going to have authors on discussing everything from industrial engineering to non-equilibrium thermodynamics in late October. And we also haven't yet selected the papers for 28, 29, and 30. So 3 papers that we're going to be able to choose. So if anybody has a paper that they would like to read, we have a list of unplaced readings in this document. So you can scan through that list. But if you have another paper you'd like to suggest, we're also always open to that. And especially if it's your paper, or if you can contact the author and get them to join us for those weeks, then that's bonus points. And this first tab of the spreadsheet is our Tuesday at 7 Pacific or 1400 GMT. It's a participatory group discussion. So it's best if you've at least tried to read the paper in terms of scanning through it, but no need to fully understand it, no need to be an expert. We're all just going there and helping each other do sense making on these really interesting papers. So please feel free to get involved if you're curious about live streaming or learning science out in the open, however it presents itself to you. Hopefully this is an affordance for you to get involved with live streams and with ActInFlab. So that's our usual Tuesday live stream series. So at this same exact time that we're doing this live stream, except other than the 4 roundtable meetings in the year, every other week we do a journal discussion. Dave?
Yeah, have we ever looked at a paper by Martin Butz in Germany toward a subsymbolic theory of computation? I'm really enjoying that.
I don't think so. Let's add it
Okay,
to the
I'll send
unplaced
you the
reading.
link. Yeah,
Great.
cool.
So as far as what are the affordances when we want to discuss a cool paper? So some papers we bring onto this Tuesday live stream. We're going to unpack it for 2 weeks in a group, hopefully with the authors. And we're also going to do a .0 video as a lab where we unpack the paper and kind of give this summary and also background and context on the paper. But we also have the affordances of these other series of streams. And just to kind of give a flavor and also get people excited for what is upcoming, let's talk about a few guest streams and model streams that we have coming up. So this is on August 9th, just next Monday. We're going to have Mark Miller is the primary presenter, along with Julian Kiverstein, Ines Hippolito, and Lars Sandved Smith. The guest stream is going to be called Exploring the Predictive Dynamics of Happiness and Well-Being. And just to read the first sentence of their abstract. In this talk, I will present some of our recent work on mental health and well-being using the active inference framework. I want to read more, but you're going to have to go listen to this guest stream because I know it's going to be a great one. So that's an example of a guest stream is some authors want to present on ongoing or recent work, or they want to just raise up some perspective, and we can just schedule any time that works for them, 48 hours later or 3 months later. The guest stream is kind of our wild card where anything that somebody wants to present that's related to active inference, we're always happy to give the venue for. And another upcoming event, this is going to be on August 19th, so just in 2 weeks, is going to be model stream number 4.1 with Bert de Vries, Thys van der Laar, and Dmitry Bagayev. And it's going to be implementing active inference by message passing in a factor graph. And this is related to the work of the Bias Lab, which is producing this Forney Lab Julia toolbox for factor graph-based probabilistic programming. So this diagram on the upper right is related to what they're going to be talking about. So if you see that, you think that looks so cool, or how is that related to active inference? This is a really powerful tool that these fellows are working on. So we're all excited to learn more about that and maybe implement it in some cases. So that'll be a great model stream. That's just some of the kinds of papers as well as the guest appearances that we get to feature here. If you want to give a guest stream on your research, or if you have a suggestion for somebody who would be great for a guest stream or math stream or model stream, we're always open to that. And bonus points if you can reach out to the author or if you are the author so that we can know that it's going to actually happen. And right now we're planning any kind of event and presentation for the rest of 2021. If it is a date in 2022 that you need to set aside, let's do that too. But we want to make the rest of 2021 really powerful and really accessible to a lot of different backgrounds. So if you're interested in doing a guest stream or suggesting, just get in contact with us anytime. We'll also, in this .coms section, give a shout out to Cognito 2021. The website is here. This is going to be an online conference in the middle of October, so only about a couple of weeks away. And there's great co-organizers. They just updated the website to reflect some of the speakers, and also several of our lab participants are going to be presenting research at this conference. So if you're curious about active inference and collective intelligence and also a lot of social topics, this is going to be an exciting conference. So just to close out in .coms, and then anyone can provide any thoughts, there are many affordances for participating in .coms. We welcome people who have been involved in the lab already or who want to get involved with leading and growing the ActInFLab accounts on social media. People who want to contribute or improve the state of our current series, which are the podcast, which is primarily Blue's work, as well as the live streams. Anyone who's interested in introducing new series and formats, in compiling and curating the research products of the ActInfLab participants. We've already had multiple conference presentations, papers where ActInFlab was written as an affiliation for an author, people who want to help onboard new participants in live streams so they understand how to set up everything from their audio and visual to conceptually what should one do to prepare, designing events, blog, short writing, tutorials, anything else that strikes your fancy. So hopefully, if you're excited about communication and or active inference, one of these opportunities is right for you. Any last comments on comms before we go to DotTools? All right, our third organizational unit of 3 is DotTools. The goals of DotTools are to, again, kind of like how .coms had an internal and an external facing side, DotTools has sort of a current and a future facing side. Our current facing side is to enable effective tool use and instrument use for all active inference lab processes. So whether it's the video chat platform we're using or live streaming, those are tools that we're using, so we want to use them skillfully. But also a little bit more broadly, DotTools is interested in exploring and designing affordances for our niche, resulting in effective action as well as innovations in tool development. And DotTools last semester had many weekly meetings where resources were shared and a lot of needs and ideas related to the systems engineering of tools were discussed. To kind of give the overview, this is a figure from our 2020 paper, Active Inference and Behavior Engineering for Teams, where we framed the operations of a remote team in terms of the structure of active inference models, which is these multi-scale nested Markov blankets with sense coming into the agent and action going out to an agent. And communication is kind of this special case, whether it's human communication or two APIs communicating or a human in a server, because one's action is the other one's sensory state. And so that kind of focus allows us to take a function-driven approach for how we think about communication and tool development using active inference. So I know that in the tools brainstorming group, people were coming up with just many different avenues and getting a lay of the land in terms of like, what does an active inference tool look like? Does it look like a newsfeed, but the ranking algorithm is different? Or does it look like a physical object? Does it look like a new way of interacting with an object we already have? A lot of pieces there. Any other thoughts on this before, Alex, why don't you then give an overview of the Nethack challenge?
Scott, you had a comment?
Oh yeah, Scott, go for it.
Hey, I just wanted to mention briefly on the tools. One of the things that's really interesting to me, I'm new to the active inference world here, is that the notion of how the tools reveal differentials. And my work, I was an attorney for 3 decades and worked in risk, basically. That's what attorneys do. We try to de-risk things. And it usually has to do with differentials, information differentials, understanding differentials. And I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting is as the tools develop, how might they be used in risk analyses in different areas? I think that there's the ability to navigate and close differentials that's implicit in the active inference framing, I think is going to prove to be exceptionally valuable in industries that deal with risk, finance, and other institutional construction. So it's just one thing I wanted to raise about the tools that right now they're used. It seems like they're analysis of active inference itself, but I think they're incidental benefits of these tools. They'll find application in myriad domains outside of academic interest in academia, where the academic interest in active inference, where there's interest in de-risking. And the tools will be used directly to facilitate the closing of gaps of information that are associated with risk. Thanks.
Yep, very cool. One of the applied projects, oh yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of the developmental nature as well, I think, you know, the instructionalism and interactionalism, which has been a developing theme, I think you could say, in the lab over the last few months, starts to now maybe revisit some of those earlier papers. You might say, okay, so we've got action. So we've got the idea of information being passed through or imprinted into a blanket as kind of blanket states, which goes into become internal states. And you've got the blanket somehow, impression in itself on the environment. So you've got this question about, okay, so traditionally we may have just been looking more instructionally, as in information comes in, information goes out. Well, now we're looking at this more interactionalist dynamic with the system boundary. You've both got an information flow and some sort of action, the actors doing it. And that then also becomes interesting. Maybe as we look at tools, this sort of question comes up. And even how to diagram that is up for grabs a little bit at the moment. But I just thought that really made me think of that.
Cool. Scott?
Yeah, just one other point on it. I think there's a lot of movement now where, from a graph theory perspective, the difference of nodes and edges, we spent a lot of human history concentrating on nodes, and that's really associated with physical space, it feels like. The edges, the interactions, the relationships, and the ability for us to describe attributes of edges and relationships, I think, is increasing, and it's increasingly part of how we do identity and other things that we rely upon in moving through space and de-risking and leveraging our behaviors. So that Stephen's comment and that notion of tools really highlighting the space between nodes and really allowing us to start to parse relationships and parse the nature of interactions and the nature of state changes and things like that, what's really going on dynamically. And the bottom line is, I think it gives us a lot more solution space within which to think together. So that parsing of interactions allows us to alight in that solution, in that middle space between nodes, and to explore together with other people, especially when there's awareness of that. And so it's very similar to what's happening now. I think in the word misinformation is beginning to attenuate, and people are starting to realize that we just have a lot of information out there, and there's all sorts of context and content and intention and all sorts of things. So we can't just say misinformation or information. And similarly, the relationships need parsing. The subtlety and nature of the interactions of different nodes in systems, I think, is going to be revealed increasingly by awareness of the attributes of the relationships that are going to be helped to be revealed through active inference analysis. Thanks.
Cool. All right, Alex, on to the Nethack challenge. So all well and good, but then how do we really apply these techniques, and how will we give a example that amazes people? What do you think about this, Alex, and what's the vision here?
Yeah, thanks. This challenge looks really interesting just because of its nature about that legendary game, and a lot of people with different ages, backgrounds know something, or maybe even play from one side, from another side. It's really one of the most difficult games in terms of solved by computers and by machine learning techniques. So, and also for now, it's interesting that challenge is hosted on research conference, and so there are some connections between possibly smart agents in this game and connections with neuroscience. And in terms of complexity and visibility, we just have to try to show up some real-life examples of applying active inference agents to some tasks, because even in our streams, we saw some examples of real-life agents which operates in complex environment, So we have proofs that it could be possible on that technical examples. So we are trying to invite everyone from the community who are interested in machine learning techniques and active inference approach, trying to solve this task. I don't know how really hard it will be, but at least it should be fun and could be first real-life applications for this programming code of active inference models.
Scott?
I have a question. When active inference was first kind of being explored and proposed, my understanding was, and tell me if this is accurate, that it was being proposed as a model for modeling biological and cognitive systems, things that were extant in the environment. And so if that's the case, one of the things I'm wondering about is, what are the differences when we intentionally invoke and apply the model in a system versus when we observe it in an existing system? Are there differences? Can we mimic? Is it biomimicry for us to pick up this framing and use it? And what are the challenges? And Alex, question to you, in your experience so far in kind of designing this, where we're desiring to create, and this goes back to my comment about contracts being synthetic Markov blankets. We are creating, I never thought of them as that, but it was, if I were thinking of them as that, it might have made me do better contracts. So what are some of the differences, if there are any, between observing an active inference framing and creating an active inference framing in a system?
You want to give a thought, Alex?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions around this too, but watching latest model streams on our channel brings more perspectives and understanding what need to be touched to do it.
It's almost like when we're talking about a system that we're making measurements from, we're doing inference on the dynamics of a system in the world. And then when we design, it does rely on eventually measurements and inference to make sure everything is going down the way that we want it to. But actually, it's a creative action that we're undertaking to truly design something. And so it's a interesting question, especially in the purely software realm. Do we just port over the same exact sort of spatial, biological, or sensory affordances? Or are there new ways that a biological system wouldn't have access to, like long-range communication or some type of internal model tweak that just doesn't really exist in biological systems? So great question, and we'll have the Nethack challenge team come back to give you some thoughts later. Dave? Oh, wait, you're muted, Dave, on the other side. Okay, I still can't hear you, but when you figure it out, we'll come back to you. But yeah, that's the Nethack. So it's happening from right now until October 15th. So if you want to get involved in Nethack Challenge, this would be the right time to do it. And the skills as laid out in our Discord and also on that previous slide, especially if you're interested in learning and applying machine learning, hacking, gaming, all these skills are important. This is not like Tetris or Pac-Man. The game itself is actually something that has to be played through because it's a challenging game. And it should tell people something that Go, chess, StarCraft, these games have been played to an extremely high level by just off-the-shelf neural network algorithms. And Nethack hasn't. And so that's sort of the barking dog, the dog that didn't bark. It should let people know that it's the type of problem maybe that integrates multi-level planning or symbolic or discrete elements. Those are the types of problems that, yes, we can recognize the dog in the image, but can we play Nethack? And the answer is no. Also, there's a special prize category for people who are using a non-neural network architecture. So all things to think about. Also other affordances in DotTools, people who are interested in applying active inference through product research and engineering and development, that's in availability. Alex will also be helping us through a systems engineering project-based learning process. And of course, anyone who wants to help us develop and improve our tool usage. Any thoughts on the systems engineering side, Alex? Okay. Yeah, now Dave?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, my major question is whether anything is going on with Rosetta Hub. Have you heard from Tim at all? It seemed like he vanished.
He's in the game.
He's in the
So
game.
mute because you're on a serious feedback loop.
Say that again?
I had to mute Dave just because he was on a serious feedback loop. With Rosetta and whatever else we use for cloud architecture for the ontology working group, we'll keep people informed on those channels. Scott?
One of the things I think is kind of interesting here is the if and to the extent that active inference is something that's naturally occurs, and we can observe in systems whether they know they're doing it or not, which I assert to people. I say that you're doing active inference whether you know it or not, and there's articles on how humans use a Bayesian knowledge construction. So those Bayesian notions are kind of embedded in a lot of human and other activities. To that extent, it's kind of interesting because I always thought about this as bringing the active inference framing to the stakeholders. If and to the extent they're already doing active inference, it kind of becomes a coaching element also of revealing the skills that are already there, the things that are already being done by the system, and then tweaking them to maximize the throughput of whatever is desired by that organization. So I hadn't thought of it before as the active inference as a naturally occurring phenomenon and as a synthetic phenomenon. I won't use the word artificial, but it's something we synthesize, and how what we're doing may be discovering an improvement of an existing human affordance, and not just human, but living affordance. And that puts a really different tweak on it. It's like, you are here in a map, so telling someone they're already doing this and let us show you how to improve it. It's like a capacity mining in a way, and something we might think about in the tools, because I hadn't thought about it that way before. But again, the people doing it and observing it where it occurs among insects and cells which don't vote and don't send out memos, and then I'm advocating at least for it among humans who do vote and trip over their own feet emotionally and politically all the time. And so it's kind of interesting if active inference is can be shown to be an efficient and or resource useful or some of their positive qualities because of nature engaging in it, and that's a demonstration of it. It offers an interesting rhetoric to its instantiation in synthetic contexts as well. That, hey, you're already doing it, why not do it well, kind of idea. Something to think about.
Cool, Scott. Thanks. Stephen?
Just to let you know, I have heard from Tim in the sense that he is going to be sharing something on a session soon. He's just had there was a few delays, but we've got the support from Karin and Latifa, and so I think progress will be shared shortly.
Cool. Great. All right. Let's look towards the future in our last little section. The next steps for the lab, which are participatory, so it's not going to happen without people who want to step up and step in and make it happen, people who want to act. The next steps are described within each unit. So for EDU, comms, and tools, we talked about what kinds of projects we're going to be doing this semester, and hopefully some of the affordances if you want to help contribute or get involved there. We're always looking to onboard new participants. So if you're just hearing about this, and it's always the right time to get involved. So contact us. And then as we head into our second semester of activity, we really want to focus more on defining our governance structures and on exploring these new affordances that are available to the nonprofit. When we were working with the terms list, and then there were these interesting discussions like, how will we decide what is a core term? And yes, there's the conceptual question of what constitutes a core term, but then there's the social question about not everyone's going to have the same exact perspective on which terms should or shouldn't be in the core terms. And maybe 9 out of 10 people just don't care, and one person decides to say yes or no on it, but that's not a governance structure. So how are we going to be able to work truly as a collective in a participatory lab in terms of the products that we make and the process, how we get there along the way? So those will be exciting steps for our second semester. And we'll kind of just close out with some of the questions that we always ask about papers, but our system of interest is the lab as organizers and as participants. So we want to know the same exact things that we would ask about a paper, like what do we want to learn? How do we want to apply it? What would we gain? Or what would be different if we had a good understanding? What are the unique predictions and implications? How are we going to check up along the way? What are the next steps? What is our policy selection? How are we going to reduce uncertainty about the ways that we achieve our preferences? What are the goals of the research? And then that remainder, the modulo, which is our curiosity, and how are we going to be driven by that differential to keep on minimizing our free energy so that we can continue developing the lab? Scott?
One of the things for us to be aware of is the lab is a machine to build machines, in a way, right? We're teaching the lab is, by doing the thing you're teaching or learning or exploring, one of the things to be really careful of is when people come in that they don't get confused by that layering. That's just, it happens a lot. I'm building a lot right now of governance systems to build governance systems. And so it's just something to be aware of, that when we're describing the functions of the lab, that we're really explicit about it being an instance of the thing it's developing as well, because that can get confusing, even though it's kind of, there's a naturalness to it. You're living, it's like Gandhi, be the future you want to see kind of thing, or whatever the quote was. But it's something to be aware of in terms of the description of the undertaking, that we have this, yes, we're doing active inference, and yes, we're living active inference. So sometimes when we're talking about active inference stuff, we're talking about the organization itself. And sometimes when we're talking about active inference stuff, we're talking about the generalized concept of active inference. And for us they don't need to be separated heavily, but they do need to be juggled, because there is a layering that's natural to us because we're working in it now, but a new entrant will get confused by that, because they'll be confused on at what level they're engaging at certain times. So we need to be very explicit about which level of recursivity we're existing in when we're dealing with something in those multiple levels.
Cool. Very true. So people can give any last thoughts, just raise their hand, but otherwise we'll just say thanks so much for participating. This was a great start to our second semester of activities in the lab. Any feedback or suggestions or questions that people have, we're always open, and the links here contain how people can stay informationally updated. Stephen, and then anyone else.
That might be a nice link into the next live stream, because I think that will talk about what it means to segregate something as an object, and when it means to maybe do more, predictive processing, and then when you segregate things into active and sensory states. So I think that is an interesting question that, as we get more immersed, will be quite interesting. Is at what point does someone mostly need to know that there's something happening at a very embodied action sensory process, or where is it like the starting point is just that there's predictive processing going on of some sort, and that it's not all purely information coming in? And then we have the whole question about system of interest again, which is always fun. So thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Stephen. Any other last comments? Yeah, Scott?
I just wanted to thank all of you for being so generous with your time and your knowledge and your ability and willingness to engage to spread this. This, to me, is a very valuable and type of set of insights, and it allows for a great deal of new innovation in a lot of different areas. It goes to fundamentally to how we think. And so I want to thank you for being beautiful people and beautiful in terms of your generosity and your wisdom. So it really is a pleasure to be able to associate with you and learn from all of you. So that's something I look forward to in the next semester. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Been great times. So on to the paper. Let's get on that Bayesian mechanics paper and start reading it and highlighting every word we don't understand yet, aka all the words, all the equations. But thanks everybody for participating live and for watching. We'll see you in the coming weeks with the guest stream with Mark Miller et al. On Monday, and then following we'll just be back in the rhythm of the papers. All right, see you later.